The assignment instructions for 2.2, which is your big assignment in the sports science section, are going to be hopefully detailed enough where you're not going to be stressed. But if you are, just let me know and we'll figure it out. The instructions are that each student should develop a proposal to present to a coach. This can be a team sport or an individual sport. And the intent is to improve sport performance. You need to be thinking about what you want to do to be able to provide objective evidence. What this particular assignment does is it shows me that you understand the research process, you understand the role of sports science in a sport organization, and it also shows me a little bit more of your ability to use data and statistics or some kind of analytic evaluation to reach a solution, which is kind of the goal throughout all the classes that I'm teaching. So hopefully you're going to get that out of this section. So there are 5 components of this project. You have an introduction, a justification. You can call it a lit review, but it's really just a justification. It's no more than a couple of paragraphs. Please don't get nervous. A methods and an analysis of data, and then a practical application. So for the introduction, basically all I want you to do is in a paragraph, tell me what you want to do and why you want to do it. You have a general description of what's going on. Stay away from any methods. Don't tell me how you're going to do anything. The last sentence that you have is basically going to be your hypothesis. Again, this should be no more than a paragraph, 2 at the most, but most of you are going to be able to knock this out on one slide or in one paragraph. And honestly, if you had just you're going to work on, if you're going to do a project on catching mechanics, let's just say that you put a picture of a catcher on the screen and you don't type out anything. You just record your voice telling me what the introduction is, telling me what the brief explanation is. You don't have to write anything down. That would be the best option. Then you have a justification. And from a research standpoint, this is where you would have the lit review, but basically, why do you want to do it? What makes this proposal legitimate? What other studies are out there? How is this going to benefit people? This is no more than a couple of paragraphs, but basically this is the justification for why you're going to go through the trouble to do the investigation. Why do you want to get into it? For example, if I want to look at, not too long ago, I asked one of our sports scientists or one of our strength coaches, what about using hand dynamometers to monitor the velocity of our starting pitchers? Because if once our hands, the strength in our hands starts to decrease, we lose the ability to control the ball, our strike percentage is going to go up. Okay, maybe its velocity is going to go down. We don't know, but it's something we could do. And they actually started working on that last year, and I have no idea what the results are, but something like that. Just what are we doing? What are we trying to do there? Now, from a method standpoint, think about your sample. Who's it going to be? What are your inclusion and exclusion criteria? If you're working on women's basketball, obviously the participants must be women on the current women's basketball team. That one's pretty easy. What instrument are you going to use? If you were doing something with basketball and you were going to look at free throw percentage versus minutes played, then you basically are going to look at previous data. You're going to look at archive data that's in the statistics or in the NCAA game score, box scores. Who knows? Is that a reliable tool? And the answer to that is yes, because everybody has to submit the same type of form. And so there are some things that I hope you're going to realize from a reliability standpoint are pretty easy. When everybody is sending a standard form, it makes the reliability pretty simple, especially in the validity for that matter. What are the instructions to these individuals? Well, if you're doing something with previous data, there's not a whole lot of instructions for those individuals. Okay, so don't read through this list and say, well, I've got to come up with instructions for the subjects for what they did last year on the court, because you can't give them instructions. They've already done it. Okay, so be very careful there. Again, a couple of paragraph max. We don't need I'm not looking for this to be a long document. I just need some basic information. Now, your analysis of data, again, do not conduct a study. Do not make up numbers. Don't put stuff out there unless you have it in your hand right now. But what I want you to do is just briefly tell me how you're going to analyze the data, how it's going to be processed and organized. What are the results going to tell us? And if the results don't tell us something that satisfies your hypothesis, either your hypothesis needs work or your analysis needs work. Okay, so remember that. If your data results do not support or satisfy the requirements of the hypothesis, you got a problem. So keep that in mind. Again, this should be no more than one paragraph, one slide. Practical application. This one's easy. One paragraph at the most. Tell me how it can help the coach or the athlete and others. That's it. You know, when you find the solution, even if it's not what you think it is, it prevents people from chasing down the rabbit hole that you just went. Okay, so that part's pretty easy. Do you have to write this in paper form? And the answer is absolutely not. You can use Adobe Spark Show. You can use the video. And again, if you use the video, you can just have photos or videos or diagrams of what you plan to do. You could, like, for example, on the data collection, you can just have the picture of the data collection sheet, and then you can just tell me what you're going to do. Right? Sometimes you know, people like that better than trying to read through a bunch of technical garbage. Okay, because remember, we're presenting this. I'm trying to convince coach A or B to do this, and I'm not saying that coaches can't understand it. I'm saying they have a very small amount of time in their day to devote to something other than what they deem to be important. And so you have to come up with a way to take advantage of the small amount of time that you have to pique their interest, to get them to engage in what you're trying to show them. And that is interpersonal relationships, but you better have good information. All right? So feel free to use whatever you want to do this assignment. Again, this is a big one for me because it shows me either you know or you don't know. So if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon.